From the James S. McDonald Foundation in St. Louis, Missouri, this is Prosperity That Works. Here, JSMF President and CEO Dr. Jason Q. Purnell explores the evidence for shared prosperity as a smart economic strategy for St. Louis. In this episode, Dr. Purnell discusses the civic culture that helped move Charlotte, North Carolina, off the bottom of a list for economic mobility in the country's largest cities. Sherri Chisholm is the executive director of Leading on Opportunity, a regional organization that worked alongside community partners to create lasting transformational change in economic mobility outcomes in Charlotte by addressing complex social challenges that no single person or organization could solve alone. Dr. Purnell and Ms. Chisholm explore what worked for Charlotte and what St. Louis can learn from that region's success.
Well, thank you again for doing this, Sherri. Really happy to have you with us on the podcast.
You're welcome. It's good to be here, Jason.
So, can you tell us a little bit about this sort of wake-up call that Charlotte got when it was ranked dead last by Raj Chetty in terms of economic mobility? What was the immediate reaction to that?
The story of what happened in the beginning and then what resulted is actually quite interesting. Raj's study comes out in 2014 that ranks us dead last in economic mobility. And at the time, Charlotte was bustling, right? Folks were moving to Charlotte in droves, in particular, millennials like myself. And we were drawn to the finance and banking jobs that would be there when we arrived, the plethora of hot yoga studios that would be there when we arrived, and an abundance of craft breweries. Like, to be really honest, it was sparkling in a lot of ways that were really attractive. And so for folks like myself who had come from other places to Charlotte, educated for opportunity, it was a gut punch. A lot of folks didn't believe it could be true in a place that had so much opportunity. But for those who had had generations of family that had been there, or for folks who worked in nonprofit more proximate to the work, it was the acknowledgement that Charlotte had long waited for. So no matter where you were on that spectrum, what happened was that Charlotte came together, as it often does, with bold urgency. We want to do things quickly, and we want to do things together. And so a task force was formed, as many communities do, to write a response to Chetty's study, which is we call it. We call his landmark study, the Land of Opportunity, the Chetty study locally. That task force wrote a report. And that took a couple years for us to get to the place where we had a report. And we struggled a bit. We struggled to move past analysis of the problem to action. And then unfortunately, in 2016, we had a police-involved shooting of a Black man. And again, we were forced to see ourselves for the things that we weren't doing well. And it's what really moved that core group of folks beyond thinking about the issue to acting. So a few months after that, with that task force report, Leading on Opportunity was established as the entity that would maintain our commitment to those recommendations in the report, such that we would be committed to it as a funding body and also be committed to it from those who were providing the programming. So the study came out in 2014, but we didn't establish ourselves and really get to work until about 3 years after.
Okay. I mean, what was that kind of a dent in the armor for Charlotte, which thought it was sort of just chugging along,
I think that
doing
would
well?
be, to put it lightly, Charlotte is a very brand conscious place. We want to be considered as a bright spot in the Southeast. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Charlotte, but until recently, there was very little negative press, right? Charlotte, in some ways, people believed, had escaped the ills and horror of pre-civil rights movement. You don't hear a lot about us during that time. It's a place with a thriving Black middle class in the Southeast. It's a place where folks are, what I often say, Charlotte is really easy to find your place. We have just enough of everything. And that is because Hugh McCall, who's the founding CEO of Bank of America and often called the godfather of Charlotte, was really intentional about that being true. So in the 80s and 90s, there was a table of the foremost leaders who came together in Charlotte called locally the table of five white men. And that was Hugh McCall. It was the CEO of Wells Fargo at the time. It was First Union, the CEO of Duke Energy, the mayor, and then one other person I always forget, but there were five of them. And they made decisions as a collective around what Charlotte would be and how it would be, what would be represented. What I often hear from Hugh is that he said he had traveled the world to places like London, Paris, also New York and San Francisco. And he wanted Charlotte to feel the same because he wanted to attract people who were talented enough to go to those other cities to choose Charlotte. And so Charlotte has designed itself and lives very much in that way. And so I think a dent in our armor would be, to put it lightly, the language that I often use is that we were really ashamed that that was true in a community that was beloved and an exemplar for what it meant to come together and grow together.
You're listening to Prosperity That Works from the James S. McDonald Foundation in St. Louis, Missouri, with your host, JSMF President and CEO Dr. Jason Q. Purnell. JSMF envisions a thriving St. Louis region where inclusive growth elevates shared prosperity and quality of life. JSMF invests in organizations and initiatives that improve economic mobility for St. Louisans facing the starkest disparities as a strategy to help build a more thriving St. Louis economy. Here again are Dr. Purnell and his guest, Sherri Chisholm from Leading on Opportunity in Charlotte, North Carolina.
It sounds like that spirit of partnership and collaboration and bold action is also what allowed you all to respond in the way that you did.
Yes, for sure. Our commitment to public-private partnerships is our bread and butter. So if you were to come to Charlotte, I think you ask anyone from the nonprofit, government, or funding and corporate sector, the truth is that we do things together. There's the expectation that there's no single organization who could solve the work, but we have to be moving, what I often say, rowing in the same direction. And that's a result of the legacy of leadership. And also, I think, in how Charlotte or Mecklenburg County, the county in which Charlotte sits in North Carolina, is often lifted up as the great state of Mecklenburg within North Carolina. We're known for getting to work and getting to action really quickly together. And I think because we had had a history of doing that for so many decades, we knew how to organize ourselves quickly around the largest issue we'd ever faced.
Have other people been invited to the table?
Say more. Other people from where? Oh, from the table of five white men?
Yes.
Yeah. So what I jokingly say, what I think is true, is that the table still exists, but it is more colorful and there is a woman present. Like, I'd like to see more women represented in our leadership, whether that be nonprofit and certainly in corporate. But Charlotte is evolving. Eddie's data, which is retrospective, as I know your audience likely knows, initially looked at folks born in 1968 and then again looked at folks born in the early 90s. Charlotte has changed a lot during that time. It went from being a primarily white and Black city to a city that is still white, Black, but has a ton of new Americans or immigrants who've come to Charlotte. And so our population is growing. And so how we approach our work needs to grow. Folks are also aging out, to be really honest. Mr. McCall now is in his early 90s. And so it calls for a new form of leadership. So the diversity has entered, but the foundations of how we work together have remained.
So can you talk more about what that task force was, how it came together, and how that led to the organization you now lead, Leading on Opportunity?
The task force was established by our community foundation, Foundation for the Carolinas. And Michael Marsicano, who'd been a longstanding leader in the community, he was the CEO of Foundation for the Carolinas for almost 30 years, is largely responsible for pulling that task force together. So the task force led by Michael was representative of corporate folks, so leaders, those in cabinet level positions at Bank of America, faith-based leaders, government leaders, grassroots organizations. And the hope was that if we had representation from across the community, we would move from being like-minded, which is great, but to like acting. And so when that group came together, they put together recommendations that align to the determinants of economical mobility as Chetty had identified. So we have a bunch of recommendations that kind of coalesce around five big buckets. One is early care and education. The second is college and career readiness. The third is family and child stability. So those are all the safety net things. So do you have a home, access to a grocery store, transportation? And then the two cross-cutting factors that we continue to see to be unique to us is one, the impact of segregation. We could not ignore that in a former slaveholding state. And then the fifth is social capital. So who do you know who can do a favor? How much do relationships impact the way that you do your work? And so with that in mind, Lead In on Opportunity was formed to support those who fund those areas and perform work in those areas to do that work well. I hope that answers the question.
Oh, it definitely does. How did the task force end up leading on opportunity?
So the task force was designed to be the thought leaders. And they were also clear that they needed an entity that would be responsible for being the doers. And I think it still continues to be quite unique that we're a community that has an entity, whether it be a standalone 501c3 or an initiative of the community foundation like us, who wakes up every day committed to specifically supporting those who do the work. So we serve as the North Star of economic mobility. And in that, we do not provide direct service because we have a plethora of really awesome direct service nonprofit providers, nor do we give out funding, but we stand in the gap. So some folks see us as a B2B type model. The language that I like to use is as a community consultant. So we're the backbone organization that provides data, strategy, and policy to nonprofit leaders, and we provide that same knowledge to funders. And the goal is that we let folks do what they do best. We reduce the complexity that is required in a fast changing community to work together to maintain the table, as we talked about, and that we create alignment. And the goal is that we do the work, but we do it more effectively together. So that's kind of like the core of how we organize Lead In on Opportunity and why the task force thought it was necessary that we have an entity that was primarily focused on it as opposed to it being a side job or an other duty as assigned for an organization that was already at capacity.
How do you approach the challenge of trying to set an agenda that is around economic mobility without some of the carrots and sticks that come with funding or uh, some sort of direct authority like an elected official in the region? How do you manage that? How do you navigate that?
I think it's something we're often grappling with. And I think this is related to what I often hear about, like, how do you manage the egos? How do you incentivize and manage egos of those who think they should be in leadership or know what they're supposed to do? And I just firmly believe that you don't avoid them, but you lean into them. And so part of what has made or helped our work to be successful is that we knew that Charlotte is not governed by, but very much so influenced by our corporate community. So as much as this is community-based work, we could not bring all the folks along if we didn't have some influential folks, faces and voices at the center. So to just speak really plainly, Lead In on Opportunity in its early phases was governed by the Chief Administrative Officer of Bank of America and our Teacher of the Year, our State Teacher of the Year. That's a signal to both audiences that we see the value in these two perspectives. They also serve as leaders who bring other people along and encourage participation. So it started there. Like, how do you make the work relevant to everyone? And then when it comes to incentivizing work in Charlotte, we're very much so driven by if other people say that we're great, right? I am from Detroit. We do not care what you think about us. But in Charlotte, we care very deeply around if we have been blessed by other well-known sources. So we continue to bring Chetty back to not only validate the work that we've done, but to work in partnership with. And these are just a couple examples, but when I talk to other communities who ask kind of a similar question, what's at the core of my answer is you have to know your community really well, like what makes it tick, what agitates it, what gets it excited, and then develop a community movement that takes all of those things into consideration.
I'm sure if there is this perception that there was a 5-person table that ran the region, that you hear from some community members about centering some of those same voices in the work that you're doing. How do you balance? I mean, you've talked about this co chair model, but are there other ways that you help validate that the, the broader community is informing the work that you're doing?
Yes. And we got it really wrong in the beginning. If I can speak really honestly, I came in as the second executive director into what now I think the community identifies as a turnaround situation. So, because of the strong corporate presence, we had developed a community initiative from a corporate mindset. And that just does not work, right? I think the community was expecting leadership at the time to give updates on what was happening quarter over quarter, because that's what you do in finance. Well, this work happens quarter century over quarter century. So there's just a
Yes.
different setting of expectations. And so when I came in, the community, so those in nonprofit or grassroots or people who would identify as people of color, were really upset about how we'd approach the work. And so I think one, I would be remiss to say that I think that who I am and my identity meant a lot. I could have some conversations that hadn't had been held before. The fact that my family was from the South, that I understood and could speak with fluency about the impact of the Great Migration, both in terms of the opportunity created and the fractures in family it also created as a result of having to go to opportunity elsewhere. So that was one. The second thing that was really important to me is that I wanted to build a team that was representative of Charlotte. And that both meant that I needed folks who had been born and raised in Charlotte, which is really hard to find. There needs to be newcomers like myself on the team who could speak about their experience. And ultimately, it was about creating something that was representative of the fabric of Charlotte, which is old and new at the same time, and trying to wrestle with like those two identities. And I think what was actually most impactful is that our council, our advisory council, is 50% corporate and 50% community. And you know who the 50% corporate folks are in any community. You know those who are most engaged and most influential. But when it came to community, initially the community folks were there, I think in name only, but not because they brought a specific set of expertise. And so it was important to me that if I brought community folks to the table, that they would be neighborhood association presidents or nonprofit leaders who could speak specifically to the determinants of economic mobility. So I brought in an early care and education expert, right, who works in a grassroots organization, but knows that work like no one else, who could push on some corporate ideas around what childcare or education could or should look like based on their experience. But this person has a PhD in the work, right? She also happens to be a Black woman. She also happens to be sitting in community. So it begins to balance the power structure in a way that did not exist before. And then I think the last thing that I would just say as a bonus is I care really deeply around how space is used. And so Lead In on Opportunity does not sit in our community foundation, which is a beautiful building. It is not inviting to community. You can't park there without paying $25, right? Like you need a space where everyone feels welcome. And so I'm really thoughtful around where we hold our meetings, what access looks like to get there, what music is playing when you walk in the room, if we're sitting in a boardroom style or we're sitting at group tables. And that's really an effort to invite people in. And then sometimes it's to make folks a little uncomfortable, right? When you walk into an environment, it's very different than what you're used to in your traditional boardroom. It causes you to reorient. And I like that. And I think it opens folks to a conversation they may not have had otherwise.
Oh, that's great. You've already you've already touched on a lot of things, but I'm wondering if you were going to advise St. Louis as we work to strengthen our regional civic infrastructure. What should we focus on, and what should we not ignore? I love the point around knowing how your region ticks
Hmm.
and what excites it. But are there other kind of critical elements that you think we should be looking at? And it's not, there are some parallels between Charlotte and St.
Hmm.
Louis, but a lot of our corporate and civic leadership was tied to homegrown corporations that are no longer home based anymore. So the Anheuser-Busch's of the world, now InBev, Monsanto, now Bayer,
Hmm.
Ralston Purina, now part of Nestle.
Hmm.
Those leaders and those families have been critical to St. Louis, but now St. Louis is an outpost in a multinational corporation, and there isn't that same kind of core
Mm-hmm.
commitment to St. Louis because people built their businesses there
Mm-hmm.
and cared about St. Louis. And it's not to say there aren't corporate and civic leaders who care. Um, it's a different flavor in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. That is similar to Charlotte. I talked a little bit earlier about how we're evolving. It's the same. So, Lowe's is headquartered here, Truist, Bank of America, all the Wells, all of those organizations have markets many other places in the US and beyond. And so it's difficult for them to maintain their focus. But I have found that is helping us is in that table that I talked about. And so I imagine you all have one of these, but we have a CEO roundtable here that we call it our Charlotte Executive Leadership Council. And that's a table of right now about 40 CEOs who come together and identify the issues that they will work on across the region. And to no surprise, their primary focus is workforce. And so our responsibility at Leading on Opportunity has been in tying those things that directly impact economic mobility to workforce. And so this is, again, like understanding your community. I think that folks sometimes struggle when I say this, but sitting in this position requires one to be really pragmatic. And so when I'm talking about the issues of economic mobility to the CELC, I'm talking about return on investment and bottom line and impact to workforce. At my core, or when I'm in community, I'm talking about this being a justice orientation or equity. The outcomes are the same, and I want them to stay on the journey with me. And so it's thinking about for St. Louis or Detroit or Atlanta, wherever you are, again, what needs to be said and who needs to communicate it in what way so that it's relevant to that audience. And so that's what I would encourage any group, and be really honest that I'm figuring it out as I go along too. There's no one single answer because the work and the our community continues to evolve.
Yeah. So one of your most powerful tools is something called the opportunity compass. Can you talk about the development and the deployment and how that came to be and how it gets used today?
Would love to. We're really proud of the Opportunity Compass. So, in the time between 2014 and early 2024, and the Opportunity Insights team was really vocal about saying they weren't coming out with another ranking. He wasn't coming out with another study. We know that has now since changed. But when I came in, one of the foremost questions that Charlotteans were asking me was, Sherri, are we still 50 out of 50? That's what we want to know. Like, have we made any progress? And there's a lot embedded in that question, but at the top level, it comes back to what I said about Charlotte being really brand conscious and wanting to know if we were doing better. Have we done better? We've been working on this. Are things getting better? And so in an attempt to answer that question, we knew that we had to come up with some accountability tool that was for Charlotte and by Charlotte, because we wouldn't have access to the tax information or Facebook data that Raj had access to through his relationships with our federal government. So we built the Opportunity Compass. It is meant to be a complementary tool to Raj's data. So the Opportunity Insights data is retrospective, so looking in the past. Our data is too, but it's only on a 2 to 3 year lag. And so that makes it a leading indicator of progress. So we're looking at the same determinants of economic mobility around education, work, the things that I identified before around family and child stability, social capital, and impact of segregation. But our data is specific to Mecklenburg County. So we go from this very national big data lens to locally assessing how we're doing. And the goal is that of course keeps us accountable and lets us know if we're moving in the right direction. But also our hope is that it's a tool of civic imagination, that it helps us set some goals around what we want to be true, take some risk around how we get there collectively, keeps the momentum going while we wait until Raj does another study, which I'm thinking that he likely will, maybe 10 years from now. So it's our own accountability tool. And we're really proud to say that Raj and his team have identified us as the only community that's developed a dashboard that does this in a way that incorporates community perspective quantitatively. So that's the Opportunity Compass. It's available on our website, and we're really excited about the power of it.
How have you seen various stakeholders and actors within Charlotte pick up the compass and use it?
And love this question. They weren't, Jason. We found that folks say they want data, and then it becomes a tool of curiosity, right? Like it's like, oh, it's beautiful, right? We've never seen a data tool that's so great. We have no idea how to use it. We don't know what to do with it, but we feel good that we have it. And that's very much so what happened. And so I have a really great data leader on my team, AJ Calhoun, who said this will not be something that folks just kind of ooh and ah at, but something that they will use. And so our data research and impact team has some really smart community psychologists who spend their time with on data activation. And so one example of what this looks like is we bring together nonprofits in the form of what we call Compass Data Workshops. This is targeted at the small to mid-sized nonprofit that doesn't have budget for a chief data officer or research type thing, but would need some outside data support. So they come and they sit with us for about an hour and a half. We align both their budget and their programming according to the indicators of economic mobility in the compass. So it's an opportunity for them to interrogate what they've been doing with data experts to think about how they might use that work outside of the room. And so we get that data from them, we play with it together, and then we package it for them in the form of a PowerPoint. They can get the raw data. They can play with it in ways that make sense for them. And what we've heard is that folks use that information to have conversations with their board. They use that information to create a pitch deck for fundraising. They use that information to make different decisions around how they're budgeting towards their outcomes. Effectively, we're serving as an outsourced data partner to them. All of this is birthed out of the compass. Very little of that what they have been able to do without our support. So that's kind of how we're activating on the nonprofit side. And on the funder side, using that same information and analyzing the CEO roundtable I told you about, their collective data over the past 3 years. So if we bring together all of their individual investments towards economic mobility in the past 3 years and we're able to say, as a collective, it looks like there's a lot of funding in early care, but not as much in housing. I'm making this up, for example. And then that group can make some informed decisions about what their collective giving looks like together. And this, I have to be really honest, we had the tool. It would not have been utilized in that way if we didn't provide that hands-on support for them. And so over the course of this year, we're continuing. That's actually where we're really leaning in, is what does data utilization and activation look like, and what are some creative things we can do from our perch.
You're listening to Prosperity That Works from the James S. McDonald Foundation in St. Louis, Missouri, with your host, JSMF President and CEO Dr. Jason Q. Purnell. JSMF envisions a thriving St. Louis region where inclusive growth elevates shared prosperity and quality of life. Here again are Dr. Purnell and his guest, Sherri Chisholm, from Leading on Opportunity in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Can you talk about how the use of data, sometimes in St. Louis, we'll hear a data point and get real defensive about it rather than using it as an opportunity or a source of learning. Have you had experiences with either data that surprises people or isn't as successful as Charlotte would like to be? And how do you manage what might be a knee-jerk reaction towards defensiveness and turn that into something that is more about an opportunity to act in a different way?
I think sometimes when there's negative data, specifically around community issues, that forces folks to identify things about themselves or their own experience that may be represented in that, right? Like it becomes very personal without that being the intent. And so how we have begun to get around that is in thinking about who's delivering the message. So that's not always me. That's sometimes other folks on my team. And then how we talk about it. So one of the things that I often struggle with economic mobility is folks want to pick one thing, right? Like, so I say, the economic mobility is improved by looking at a constellation of things, right? If you think about your own experience, if you take away your two-family household, or if you take away your education experience, or if you take away your access to high quality education, would you have had the same outcomes? And that makes a lot of sense to me. However, it has not resonated as much with my corporate partners. So they say, well, Sherri, like people just need a job. And I'm like, well, if you have a job, but you don't have a car, or if you have a job, but you have, family to take care of, or if you have a job, but you don't have stable housing, like that just doesn't work. And I still don't know why that doesn't resonate, Jason. But if AJ on my team, who is from Charlotte, who is a white male, who says, well, think about it like your investment portfolio. You're not going to put all your money in one thing, right? You're going to think about what a diversified approach is to get the highest return on investment. Ding, 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 ding. Now it's like resonating with folks in a way that I wouldn't have even thought about how to communicate in that way. So I think that's the answer. That's the answer I have now in terms of how we work through those things.
No, I think that's an incredibly insightful answer. I tell people all the time, numbers are only about 3,000 to 5,000 years old. We've been telling
Yeah.
stories since we arrived on the planet. So you can't just show up with data.
Yeah.
You've got to be able to contextualize it and tell a story about it. And it sounds like that's a thread that you've woven throughout all of your work is how do we package this? Who's the right messenger?
Hmm.
What are the things that are going to motivate people to action rather than this sort of one note,
Yeah.
one trick pony? We're just going to storm the battlements and hope everything goes well.
Yeah. This is the world according to Sherri, and maybe there's some research out there that I'm just not aware of. But I think that this work, building a movement or community initiative is like running a campaign. All the things you think about around what it takes to get an elected official in office, to get folks excited about them, to understand the core of their stomp speech, to make them relatable and attractive. Like I think about this work kind of from that perspective. And the excitement around an individual is fragile, right? Like it takes one scandal to knock them down. And in the same way, when you're taking on
It
something,
used to.
yeah, well, so true, Jason. So true. Um, in the same way, folks lose their attention or get bored with work around economic mobility. And that's very real for us. So I'm often thinking about how do we reinvigorate what's happening? How do we build excitement again, right? What new infusion of whatever do we need to be a part of the work to keep people along? And again, I think folks who do this from a justice mindset are like, that sucks. Like, we shouldn't have to do that. And yet, this is where we are. So part of it is accepting, at least for me, that if I want you to continue with me, then I'm going to have to keep you excited about the work. And that's going to cause me to do some things I may not have thought about initially, but in the best interest of what I want the ultimate goal to be, I'm willing to do that.
Yeah. We got to deal with the world that we have in order to get the world that we want.
That's so much more succinct and beautifully said, Jason. Thank you.
No, I took it from you. Yeah. I do want to get into, the headline 50th to 38th in 10 years is a great headline, but the recovering academic in me wants to know, what are the active ingredients?
Mhm.
And was it something that Charlotte did, or was it, just the passage of time and things changed in some other regions? And I mean, how do you all think in Charlotte about the active ingredients that allowed for that move up 12 spots in the ranking of the 50 largest metros in terms of economic mobility? What are the things that you think you can hang your hat on and said, we did that
Mhm.
and it had this effect?
I think this is a really important question because folks often get confused around the pace of change. The first thing is that we ground in our collective past. Yes, we went up 12 spots, but that did not happen between 2014 and 2024. And I think that's hard for folks to accept, but it is the truth that Charlotte has been at this work for at least 3 decades. As Raj says, you have to wait for kids to grow up, right? Like I can't tell you 10 years later if they're doing better. I need to be able to tell you how they are at 35. So one is grounded in our collective past that we've been at this for a really long time, but that gave us a formula to keep going. The first thing is we would be remiss in not naming that Charlotte went through a huge economic boom. We did. We grew rapidly because economically we increased quite a bit. A commitment to public-private partnership helped us weather the recession of the early 2000s better than others had. So we were hit acutely, but we had an organized structure to respond. So that's one. We grew tremendously economically, but we're also organized around that growth. The second thing is we had the collective will to act. I think it matters a lot that we have been moving in the same direction and a commitment to do that. And so the fact that when you come to shop, folks will lift up economic mobility as a priority across the ecosystem is important. And then the last piece that sometimes gets left out is that we have been at systems navigation for a long time. Raj often talks about not just providing the direct service, but providing supports on how to do that work best. Nonprofit community has been doing that since the 90s. I think that has also helped folks who have been given access to increased opportunity to make some smart decisions around where they live and work so that they have access to better schools in particular to prepare them for adult opportunity.
So that's a really important message. This didn't start in 2014.
No, say it over and over and over and over again, please, Jason. Get the great benefit of, being the person who is carrying the torch now. And as a result, I have the microphone. I did not do that. The reason that we went from 50 to 38, the data that he's measuring happened when I was in middle school. So there's no way I could have done that. Charlotte has been at it for a long time. The work that I've been able to lead is by identifying, codifying, and communicating the platform by which that's possible. And the platform that I've built is built on the great leaders who came before me. This work is long generational work. It really is. And so Charlotte has been at it long enough that we've seen some progress. And what I get to lead today, I hope is even better for my 4-year-olds by the time that they measure her data 30 years from now.
Yeah. I do, though, think it's important. When you were here in St. Louis and we had that lunch conversation, one of our leaders of our large business organization said, well, Charlotte's growth is why uh, this is possible. And what I just heard you say is that the growth is only part of the
Mm-hmm.
equation. The commitment to collaboration, public private partnership, doing the work better and pressure testing whether or not the things that you're trying to do actually make sense for people and their lives and their outcomes is the added
I
ingredient.
think that the
It's not just a growth
That's
story.
exactly right. We put together a timeline of economic mobility work leading up to the launch of the 2014 study because we wanted to have some evidence of, yes, the growth that Charlotte has been on economically, but some very intentional things we did that helped our community. And those were things like bringing an international airport to Charlotte. That's economic development, but it also gives access to opportunity. We increased by having sports teams. So those things matter. And we also have initiative after initiative around where we came together as a corporate and community leaders to invest in the education of Black boys. Or we came together to improve our hospital system so that we have clinics in underserved neighborhoods. We came together such that we can improve reading scores, like one initiative after another during that growth, so that that growth would be equitable and not only available to those who already had the opportunity.
Absolutely. You were not waiting for a rising tide to lift all
Not
boats
by any
when everybody
means.
didn't have a boat.
Charlotte gets to work.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I know one of your challenges, because you've told me and the audiences that we've brought together, is preparing people for that long time horizon of this work. Have you found effective ways of communicating that where people actually believe you?
I think it goes back to what I said before about managing this like a campaign. So when we went from 50 to 38, that put us in the spotlight nationally, where folks like yourself are really excited about us. Locally, it was kind of like, okay, we're done. Like, we're good. We did it.
Yeah,
And so for me, and I saw that coming. So I said, well, what infusion do we need to excite folks for the next round? And so where we are, next round of work, so where we are right now is bringing in national partners to say Charlotte has something special, right? How does Charlotte become the bright light or um, what do we call it here? Kind of the crown jewel in the Queen City to other places. Again, this can feel really gross to think about the work in that way, but it keeps the corporate community continuing to invest. It highlights the folks who had already been doing the work to get more opportunities to do that. And it keeps us on the path of economic mobility. I think a more succinct way of saying that is while the journey is long, you need some like stops along the way to celebrate how far you've come. And for right now, that's the approach that we're taking.
Makes a lot of sense. Sherri, just thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your experience and your insights on what it takes to really bring a region together around economic mobility, and build on the strength and the foundation of a place like Charlotte, to take it to even higher heights. Just deeply grateful for you and the work that you do.
Thank you so much. This has been so much fun, Jason. I appreciate the opportunity.
You've been listening to Prosperity That Works from the James S. McDonald Foundation in St. Louis, Missouri, hosted by JSMF President and CEO Dr. Jason Q. Purnell. Find out more about the work JSMF supports and connect with the foundation at jsmf.org. And be sure to subscribe to catch future conversations about how, together, we can build a prosperity that works for all.